I'm Rashed Rahman. I think it's difficult to retell a life, but I will make some effort to do that. I was born on 5th June 1948, barely a year after Pakistan came into existence. So you could say that Pakistan and I are coterminous. I was born in a relatively privileged background. My father was the Chief Justice of the Lahore High Court, later the West Pakistan High Court, and then he went into the Supreme Court and retired as its Chief Justice. When I say privileged background, that doesn't mean that we were rolling in the lap of luxury or anything. My father, I think it was the norm in those days, was an honest person. I know they're rarer now in Pakistan, but they were more frequently found then. And so we lived within our means, which could not be described as luxury by any means, but of course comfort. I remember that I was born in a house on Lawrence Road, 47 Lawrence Road. Unfortunately, the house no longer exists. It's been torn down and turned into a housing estate. It was an old bungalow which belonged to a relatively well-off Hindu family who of course went to India at the time of partition. Since my father was in 47-48 also the commissioner of evacuee property, so he was given this as his official residence. It was a large bungalow in the old style, colonial style, very large gardens, front, back, huge vegetable patch, old trees, and at the back a tube well, next to which was tethered a she elephant which had been left behind by this Hindu family. And we loved the elephant, of course, as children, but eventually it was eating us out of house and home, so it was donated to the Lahore Zoo. Must have died some years later. I lost touch. We also had lots of other animals. There was, I remember, a couple of deer and rabbits, hens, ducks, there was a whole menagerie, in fact. And I remember that as children, of course, this was of great fascination to us. We fed the animals, we played with them, we, did all the things that children do with animals. Early schooling, first a nursery in the neighborhood run by Mrs. Manzoor Kadir, whose husband, Mr. Manzoor Kadir, of course, a very famous figure in Pakistan, brilliant lawyer, eventually Foreign Minister of Pakistan, and she ran this nursery, so all the kids went there because it was virtually around the corner. From there I was sent off to Sacred Heart Convent School, which still exists. Although it's a girls' school, but boys were allowed in that school at least in KG 1, 2, 3, which is what I did there. My memory of that school is that it was very strict, run by nuns. So we got our first taste of Catholic discipline very early in life. From Sacred Heart, I went on to St. Anthony's High School, which at that time, also on Lawrence Road, which at that time was the premier school in Lahore. Aitson existed, but it was the chief's college, meaning the sons of landed, people, and the reputation it enjoyed was it was a place you went to if you wanted to play sports, ride horses, and do things like that. It wasn't particularly well known for studies, but St. Anthony's was the place to go if you wanted to get a good education in those days. It was run by Irish brothers and also very strict discipline. I seem to recall that. I was a good student. I think in all my schooling years, I probably never came less than the first 3 in my class, and very often the first in my class. So obviously there must have been something to me at the time. In fact, when I was in 5th standard, we used to call them standards in those days, one of my teachers was so impressed with my studies that he wanted to give me a double promotion. A double promotion meant you skipped a class and you went on to the next class. But my parents refused because I was already 2 years younger than the average age in my class. And so they thought, bahut hi chota ho jayega, and he'll lose his friends also, and maybe it will affect his studies. So maybe it's not a good idea. There's no hurry. He's already ahead in terms of years, So they refused that. I did my senior Cambridge from St. Anthony's High School in 1963. Now I have to tell you a story. The upbringing at home was strict, disciplinarian, which is the way children were brought up in those days. Things have changed now. My mother was the enforcer of the discipline. And despite the fact that if you stepped too far out of line, you'd get the occasional slap from her, we were not so much terrified of my mother as, ironically, my father, who never said a word to us in anger. But the awe and, the authority he enjoyed in the home was enough to scare us. Father mustn't say anything to us, mother can do what she likes. Now, the ironic thing is that whereas I was a very well-behaved child at home and accepted parental authority and didn't resent it and loved them and all that, yet from very early in my life, I had a streak of anger in me. Now, where did that stem from? I'm famous for this. And my mother used to describe me to her friends and anybody within earshot. They had nicknamed me Tambudi, which in Punjabi means a hornet, okay, because of my anger. Where did that anger stem from? When I look back with hindsight, I think there was a very strong streak of distinguishing between right and wrong in me. And stemming from that, some sense of indignation at anything I thought was wrong. And I think the anger probably came from there. I remember in my senior school year in St. Anthony's, when I was in senior Cambridge, I was the head boy of the school. And I seem to recall that sometime in late summer, I don't remember the date exactly, you can check that, it was Liaquat Ali Khan's death anniversary, who, as you may know, was our first Prime Minister. And normally it would have been a national holiday. But on this occasion, there was no announcement, and so, we were feeling very hard done by because we'd lost out on this holiday. You know what holidays are like when you're in school. When I arrived in the school in the morning, I saw a lot of little young boys making a lot of noise. So I inquired what was the matter, and they said, they're agitating because it's supposed to be a holiday normally and it's not a holiday. And secondly, the flag on the school, which should have been flying at half-mast in respect, was flying at full-mast. So there was a lot of agitation on this issue. Now, I and a few senior colleagues, friends, classmates got together and decided that this is not on and we must do something about it. So what did we do about it? In the entire history of St. Anthony's High School, we had a strike. All the student body just refused to go to class, stood there in the assembly area and in the lawn and the playing grounds and so on, and just refused. Some say it was central. I don't want to boast, but I was the head boy. Don't forget. Now, of course, eventually discipline and better sense prevailed. We were called to assembly, and it was a very brief assembly. Our principal was a brother Fitzpatrick, who was well known for being a very strict disciplinarian. And in those days, discipline in schools like that meant caning. You were bent over and given a few on your backside. Believe me, it was not pleasant. Corporal punishment existed in schools in those days. And so he was very angry in the assembly, and he said, I will get to the bottom of this, who's behind this strike, and we will take action against them. Now we're all a bit apprehensive, what's going to happen next? Anyway, we went off to class. Now our senior Cambridge class, was on. when suddenly Brother Fitzpatrick, the principal, appeared and addressed the class. And he said, I'm being told that the ringleaders of this whole agitation are in this class. Now we're all looking this way and that way, wondering if he's going to name us, if he knows. But he apparently didn't. He just had a suspicion. Anyway, he went away, promising, to take action against whoever was responsible. Now an hour passed, another period passed, nothing happened, because he had announced in the assembly that he sent someone to the education authorities to find out if it is meant to be a holiday or not, and also announced that he'd had the full mast flag corrected to half-mast. So we decided, no, we're not going to let go of this. So a delegation of the house captains, myself, we went to see the principal. Unprecedented. He was as surprised to see us as we were as to what we were up to. So we went to him and we said, sir, the students are asking. You had announced that you sent someone to the education authorities to inquire whether it was a school holiday or not. We wanted to find out what the answer was. He said, yes, I found out it's not a holiday. And then he turned to us and he said, my suspicion about the ringleaders being in the senior Cambridge class, those are very deep suspicions. Now he's looking straight at me. So I thought, either I respond, otherwise I'm gone. I'm a goner. I'm going to be expelled. So I said, sir, are you suggesting I'm not doing my job the way it should be done? I was the head boy. He said, what? I said, sir, are you suggesting that I'm not doing my job the way it should be done? Then he backed off. No, he said, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, I'm being told the ringleaders are here. I said, sir, we've come to you just to inquire on behalf of the student body, and we don't know who it is. It was behind this. He said, all right, go back. So that was the end of our strike. The first and only strike, I believe, in St. Anthony's High School's long history. So what I'm trying to portray is this indignation, sense of right and wrong, anger, and outside the home at least, not in the home, but outside the home, an aversion to authority. It came very early to me. And it had very profound consequences later in life, as we will find out. Now, my reputation of being a tamburi, as I told you, rested on the fact that when I was very small and we were living on Lawrence Road, my father's peon used to put me on his bike and take me to school and then bring me back on the bike. One day he came back with me and told my parents, I'm not going to fetch him from tomorrow. They said, why? What's happened? He said, रोज देर हो जाती है. कभी ये किसी के ऊपर चढ़े होते हैं, लड़ रहे होते हैं, कोई इनके ऊपर चढ़ा होता है, लड़ रहा होता है, रोज लड़ाई हो रही होती है, रोज देर हो जाती है, मैं कल से नहीं जाऊंगा. So the Tambudi, perhaps appellation, was well earned. I was one of the smaller boys in my class, skinny, not very strong, but I wasn't going to take any bullying from anybody. My experience in life has taught me that bullies are actually cowards. If you stand up to them, they can't take it. It's beyond their comprehension. I remember there was a very good, who's now a very good friend of mine, class fellow, real toughie, I won't take his name, and well known for beating up people for no rhyme or reason. So one day I remember in Gulberg, where we lived after Lawrence Road, we moved there in 54, I think. And I was sitting on the railing of the Ganda Nala next to the College of Home Economics. Our home is just next to that, 65 Main Gulberg. And this friend passed by on his bike. So I just motioned to him to come, and chat to me. At that time he didn't say anything. Next day he turned up at my house. And he said, why did you make this gesture to me? I was just calling you. What's the problem? Threatening me. I said, listen, I know you're bigger and tougher than me. You land 4, I'll land 2. Okay, fair enough, come along, no problem. He backed off, would you believe? And we became friends. And we remain friends. So these are lessons, early lessons in life.
Tell us more about your friends from school.
Yeah, I had two very close friends, I would say best friends. One was a boy who lived across from us. I must tell you about Gulberg in those days. In the early 50s, I think around 52, it was suggested to my father that this new colony was being developed called Gulberg, new colony. Lahore was a very small city and everybody knew everybody else. This is what we still call Old Lahore, which is a dying species. So he was offered a plot in Gulberg on the main boulevard. And he said, "Are you mad? You think I'm going to go across the canal into the Bundus?" No, they said, Judge Sahab, this is going to be the place to live in future, so accept. So he accepted it. We moved there in 54, and along the entire length of the main boulevard, which today is so busy, there were perhaps 5 or 6 houses. And where the Liberty Roundabout stands today, fields started. And there was a Persian wheel there with a well where we used to go on our bikes to picnic. At night we heard the jackals and shivered in our beds. That was Gulberg in those days. And before my very eyes and later in life, I've seen it transform beyond recognition. I suppose that's the way of all flesh. Things change. One of my two best friends was a boy called Amir Haider, who lived across from us in number 62, where the Shanghai Chinese restaurant now stands. That's their house. His father was a doctor, and he and I just became friends inexplicably. He was a very great influence on me, I think, in my early years, growing up years. 2 or 3 things I learned from him. One was courage, which I mentioned. Don't be bullied, don't be afraid, never back down. I think, and he was big and tough, so he knew what he was talking about. The second thing I learned from him was modesty. He was one of the most modest people I've ever met. When I met him many years later, he changed. That's another story. But growing up years, he was a very modest person. He would never boast about himself or his qualities or his, achievements or anything. And I think that had a lasting influence on me. All my life, I've been very reluctant. And therefore, this whole exercise, this interview is very painful for me because I'm talking about myself. Normally, I feel embarrassed because advertently or inadvertently, I may say things that seem like boasting or praise of myself. So I'm very cautious about that. But anyway, this is something I learned from him. So we were in each other's houses all the time. We played together, we spent time together. We were virtually inseparable. My second closest friend was a Hindu boy. He's a class fellow. His name was Savtintar Kumar. His family was one of the old Hindu families of Lahore. His grandfather was called Beli Ram, and they had a pharmaceuticals shop in Anarkali called Beli Ram and Sons, and they lived above it. This is the old way of living in Lahore. And his house was virtually mine, my house was virtually his. We shared each other's festivals. He was in my house on Eid. I was in his house on Diwali and Dussehra and all their festivals. His mother, short, fat, roly-poly, a real mum, was a great cook. And in traditional style, they used to cook sitting down. The chula was on the floor. They sat on these little PDs and they cooked there. So she used to line up all the children in a semicircle and then dish out the food to all of them, and we ate there. True sort of traditional Hindu household style. So I was familiar with that. And she used to feed us till, we just couldn't eat anymore. Or cow. She was so sweet to us. Um, so school years, good student, well behaved by and large, but with a streak, as I said, of anger, indignation, and some of the peculiarities that I've talked about. After doing my senior Cambridge, I went to government college. Now that was a very interesting year. I just spent a year there and then I went away to study in England. It was an interesting year because nowadays, the fashionable phrase is gap year. Okay, before you sort of go on to the next phase of your education, you take a year off and do whatever you want to do, travel, explore, whatever. There was no concept of gap year in those days. But it so happened that I went to government college, but I knew I was leaving for England. So I knew I wasn't going to have to, really pay attention to any examinations or, getting through or anything. So I decided to have fun for one whole year. I attended class when I wanted to. I even attended classes I wasn't supposed to. And the new French teacher in government college, who just returned from Paris, from the Sorbonne, was very attractive and young. So of course I had to go to her class to see what was going on. And I got away with it for at least 3 or 4 classes. She didn't notice me. And then one day, she noticed me. She said, "Who are you? What's your roll number?" I was caught. I said, "Ma'am, I'm not in your class, but I love to attend your classes, so I'm here." "Get out," she said. And that was the end of that. So we got up to these tricks. Now that whole year, chasing girls, swimming, playing golf, playing tennis, playing bridge, I and a group of friends, we got into bridge. Now bridge, can be very, very, how shall I put it, seductive. It takes you over. It's like chess, okay? So it was virtually, playing bridge, breakfast, lunch, dinner on the table, playing bridge. And got into trouble at home quite often for being out late and got a few slaps in the process. But anyway, subsequently in life, when I decided that I wanted to do some important things, what I thought were important things in life, I decided bridge is out. If you play bridge, you can't do anything else. It takes you over. It was a very nice year, a lot of fun. We used to swim in the railway golf club where the Royal Palm now stands. It used to be the railway golf club in those days. And I remember an incident where I almost drowned in that pool. I wasn't a good swimmer. I was just learning. And I did the adventure of being in the middle of the pool and walking down the slope from the shallow side towards the deep to see how far I could go before my feet wouldn't touch the floor. And when I got there, there's a tide. And it swept me off my feet. And there I was in the water, splashing around. And then, of course, desperately I struck out for the side of the pool and made it, having swallowed a bit of water. So that taught me a lesson. I learned to swim. Now, I knew I was leaving, so I was just having fun. And I think some of my class fellows and friends who shared that with me, I'm sure they have good memories of that year.
Did you like reading?
Yeah, from a very early age, I took to reading like a duck to water. We started with comics, which was the thing in those days. And from comics, you graduated slowly to books, and then more and more serious books as you went along. So the important thing about that is the reading habit. Once you get into that habit, life is not the same. It is as much a part of your being as anything else. So I think those early habits produced in me the habit of being a voracious reader all my life. Today, I can't say I read as much as I do because the work is very exhausting mentally. But I get in what I can. I still cannot go to sleep without reading. My progression through reading, as I said, from very light to less light to heavier to more serious things, is the kind of trajectory. When I left for England in February 1965, I was all of 16 years old. My elder brother Shahid was already at Oxford University, so the parents thought, okay, he's going to be in London, Shahid will be in Oxford, he'll look after him. Little did they know that, it doesn't work like that, because where was I going? I was going to do chartered accountancy. So you actually work in a professional accountant's office in the City of London. So I became a City of London gent, all at the age of 16. And that meant I was in a three-piece suit, tie, brolly, briefcase. You wouldn't have recognized me in those days.
Why chartered accountancy?
My parents' choice, mistakenly, in retrospect, they thought I was very good in maths. And, that was perhaps one of the basic requirements for this kind of a profession. As I told you, we were comfortable but not rich. And my parents thought that each one should get a professional qualification. So we would be off and running in life, no problem. So for instance, my elder brother, of his choice by the way, decided to go and read law at Oxford, having graduated from here. Government college again. Government college, and we have a long family history. My father studied there, my elder brother, my sister, and me. My younger brother didn't, for reasons I'll get into. So he went into law, and they thought best thing is put this one into accountancy. There were only a few professions that people went into. Law, medicine, engineering, chartered accountancy was virtually it. So they thought this is best for him. Now, parents mean well, and they meant well by me. But I think they perhaps didn't recognize who I was and what my bent or potential was. So about halfway through the 5 years that it takes to do chartered accountancy, it took 5 years after senior Cambridge in those days, I realized that this was not for me. I was miserable. I wanted to quit. I had a midlife crisis at age, 18. Most people have it later. So I discussed it with my brother, and there was a problem, because quitting at that point meant starting all over again after senior Cambridge. I wasn't sure how the parents would see that, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to burden them with that sense of filial duty, So my brother suggested to me that perhaps the best solution was for me to finish and then go on to do whatever else I might want to do. So I think for lack of better option, I plumped for that. So I finished my accountancy. But I hated it. I hated auditing. I hated, accountancy per se. And I hated the city, its gents, its culture, the British arrogance, which I confronted and which I didn't accept. So I had some bruising encounters with people who thought they were superior to me just because they had a white skin and had once been our colonial masters. Aged all of 17, we used to be sent out on audits to the countryside factories, and we would stay in the local hotel, few colleagues, and go to work in the morning. And in the evening we would often meet to have dinner, etc. So a lot of arguments in those days. And I remember once this colleague would become a friend, much older than me, had brought his fiancée along. So we were having an argument about something or the other, not he and me, somebody else and me. And he turned to her and he said, "You know how old this guy is?" She said, "No." He said, "He's 17. She was shocked. She almost fell off her stool. So precociousness is what I'm trying to tell you. And that precociousness, I think, came perhaps some God-given intelligence, natural, and then voracious reading. and just a bent towards wrestling with ideas, shall we say. Now that was going to have profound consequences later in life, which we'll come to. So here I am in my midlife crisis, and this is now, we're talking about 67, okay? Now having decided, okay, there's no choice, I have to go on, finish this, and then I can decide what to do. I had an interest from very early days. Actually, it runs in my family. My elder brother, my sister, we were all very interested in stage, theatre, acting. My brother did it. GC had a great tradition. The Government College Dramatic Club was very well known in those days, and its annual play was the event of the year, in many ways. And so he had been in them, my sister had been in them, and then I was in them. And in my year, in 1964, in Government College, it was the centenary year, 100 years of Government College. And so it was a very big occasion. And I remember the new auditorium, Bukhari Auditorium, it still exists, had been built for the occasion, and we were the first performance in the Bukhari Auditorium. We did Arsenic and Old Lace. And I had a small role in it, but it was very interesting because I'd done a bit of stage theatre in school also. So clearly there was some talent in my genes or in my blood or in my family or whatever. Now, in the middle of this midlife crisis, now I'm trying to decide what to do. And I decide that what I want to be is a stage actor. So I enter into, England has a very good program. You can go to evening classes. They organize them. And you can do anything. You can learn anything. And it's so cheap, it's just totally affordable, no matter how poor you are. So I decided to take acting classes. And my teacher had been a member of Brecht's Berliner Ensemble, which is one of the great theatre companies in the history of theatre. And of course, Marxist, communist, progressive. And so she was my teacher, and she brought to us some of the techniques that Brecht and that ensemble had pioneered. And I and another English girl were her star pupils. And she often said to me, she said, you're not good looking enough to play lead roles on stage, but you're intelligent and you could be a very good director. So with those words ringing in my ears, I went on from strength to strength. And then, just when I think I was on the verge of finishing my courses with her, I left. Now, why did I leave? Why did I give up, what was till then at least my burning desire to go on stage? Because she used to prepare you for auditions at one of the academies, the acting academies, RADA or Lambda or, Central School. And once you go into those schools, and you can get funding, scholarships for that, then you are, if you're not terrible, if you are even reasonable, you are off and running on a career, because any graduate of those schools is immediately plucked by, the theatre community. So this was preparatory classes to do an audition, to go to one of these academies, become an actor, and go on stage. And then suddenly, in the middle of all this, finito. Why? Now here, we get into what was happening to me in these years. I told you I was a voracious reader. And one of the habits I picked up when I went to England was reading a newspaper every day religiously. Now, in those days, there was no internet. Television, there was no satellite television. You had local, national television, terrestrial, not satellite. Of course, you had the radio. So finding out about distant places, countries, the world as a whole, was not as easy as it is today. Today it's available to you at the click of a button. Okay? That was not the case. So newspapers are very important because they brought the world to you every morning. And my favorite paper in those days, which later I rejected, was the Times because it had excellent coverage of everything under the sun. I was a voracious reader and I picked up the habit of reading a newspaper every day. I began to learn about the world. Two or three events in those years of reading, I think, left an indelible mark on my development. I would say the first one in terms of sequence was the Cultural Revolution in China in 1966. Now that fascinated me because I told you about my rebellious streak from very early years. And what fascinated me about that was this incredible experiment that Chairman Mao was trying to bring about. Here was a communist party in power, which had come to power through a long, protracted armed struggle. And it was in power since 1949. And then suddenly, in 1966, Mao, the leader of the party, decides that there are people within the party leadership who are taking it down the wrong road. The experience of the Soviet Union had a lot to do with that, because the Soviet Union and China fell out over the fact that Khrushchev took the Soviet Union in a direction that the Chinese called revisionist, okay, i.e. abandoning the revolution. He had fears that in his own leadership there were people who would perhaps take the same path, and so he launched a movement of millions upon millions of young people who were called Red Guards to carry forward the revolution and ensure that it wasn't pulled back or didn't deviate. And he gave two slogans which struck me like a silver bullet between the eyes, and I still can't forget them. The first, and I think the most important for me, was, "It is right to rebel." Now imagine the rebel within me responding to that slogan. It is right to rebel? Wow, I mean, this is something incredible. This is what I've been looking for, searching for, without knowing it. And the second slogan, which was equally important, was, "Bombard the headquarters," meaning the leadership which is deviating. Now, the Cultural Revolution may later have gone wrong. We can discuss that some other time. But the initial impact of the idea of continuing a revolution through young people, recognizing them as the inheritors and those who would take it forward and ensure that it didn't deviate, was such a radical idea that nothing had been heard like that in the entire history of Marxism. So that fascinated me. The second event, I think, which was seminal in my development was the death of Che Guevara in Bolivia in 1967. I knew nothing about Che Guevara. I knew nothing about the Cuban Revolution, Castro, all that. But suddenly, when I read about this guy dying in Bolivia, who's Argentinian in origin, has been involved in movements in Latin America, eventually joins up with the Cuban Revolution, they wage a successful revolution, come to power, he is at the peak, he's one of the leaders of the revolution. And then one day, in 1965, he just gives it all up and disappears. Where does he go? He goes to make revolution in Congo. Doesn't succeed. Then he goes to Bolivia. And the idea is very ambitious. It's going to be a revolution that it will eventually expand into the whole of Latin America. The idea that really impressed me was this idea of renunciation for a higher cause. I think there must have been some Sufi streak in me which responded to that. The idea of renunciation of worldly fame, power, whatever, in pursuit of a pure ideal. Now, I think I'm not the only one who was affected by that. And he put his life on the line, was killed for it. So it was as pure as you could get. I think I'm not the only young person who was influenced, impressed by that. A whole generation was. And Che became an icon. And in the subsequent years, when we all took to the streets to protest one thing or another, Che was very much there, on our flags, on our banners, on our t-shirts, on anything we could find. It's possible to disagree with many things that Che did or wrote or said, but the example is unassailable. I think the third event, seminal event, that influenced me in those young adolescent years, I'm just, on the verge of adulthood, was the Vietnam War, which had been on since '63 when Kennedy launched Green Berets to try and stop communism in Southeast Asia. But by '65 it had escalated to a regular war. Kennedy was killed in '63, Johnson was in power, and the Americans were now sending their military in. And by the end they had 500,000 men in South Vietnam. It was the first televised war in human history. Every evening, in your living room, through the box, through the television, you saw that war, virtually at first hand. You saw the blood and guts, you saw the gore, you saw its horrible side, and you saw this Asian people, small, dressed in black pajamas and straw hats, with at best a Kalashnikov, beating the greatest military power in the world, the United States of America. I mean, it was awesome. And what struck us about it was the manner in which they fought. It was guerrilla warfare, classic. And they had experience of it. They fought the Japanese during the Second World War when the Japanese had occupied Southeast Asia. Then they fought against the returning colonialist French and defeated them in 1954, the great battle of Dien Bien Phu, where General Vo Nguyen Giap, one of the great military leaders in history, brought this imperial power to its knees. Unfortunately, what followed in the Geneva meetings, conferences that took place to try and find a solution, the promises that were made to the Vietnamese people, that they would be allowed to have an election within 2 years and decide their future and so on and so forth, those promises were never kept. So what was basically a demilitarized zone to separate the warring forces, the French and the Vietnamese, became a permanent divide with the help of the West and the US in particular. And so they built up South Vietnam as a separate country, or tried to. Didn't work, of course, because in the end they won. But the level of sacrifice, the level of commitment, and the David-Goliath nature of the struggle, I think it inspired my entire generation. And there was an additional factor to that, and that was, the 60s were a time of great change. In Western society in particular, but I think it had its impact on the world all over. Now, what was happening in Western society? Let's start with the United States of America, which after all was the richest, most developed, incredible resourced country in the world.